When a farmer buys an old rusty truck that everyone mocks, no one suspects how crucial it will soon become. This story reminds us, never judge something by its appearance. Hit the like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The small farming town of Dry Creek stretched beneath the late afternoon sun like an old photograph nobody bothered to frame. Wooden porches sagged under their own age, paint peeled from storefronts in long curling strips, and dust from the unpaved main road drifted slowly in the air long after a single car passed. Life here moved at the steady, predictable rhythm of seasons and harvests, and the people who lived in this forgotten dot on the map clung to familiarity like it was the only thing keeping them afloat. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew everyone's business, especially when that business looked foolish enough to talk about. On the outskirts of town, where the fields turned gold in the wind and the fences leaned tiredly toward the earth, stood the county's old machinery auction yard. It wasn't much more than a fenced dirt lot filled with the skeletons of tractors, trucks, mowers, and other tired relics that farmers had used until their final sputter. Rust clung to everything like a second skin, the air thick with the bitter smell of oxidized metal and spilled gasoline. Crowds gathered here once a month, not out of real need, but more for the show of it, for the chance to point, joke, bargain, and watch someone else make a mistake. It was on such a day that Thomas Hale first saw the truck. He hadn't come looking for anything specific. In truth, he hadn't even planned to buy. He had driven to the auction simply because the farm no longer kept him busy the way it once did, and empty evenings had a way of pressing on him like a weight he couldn't name. But when he stepped out of his own well-maintained, sensibly modern pickup and walked between the rows of rusted metal, something tugged at him with quiet insistence. At the far end of the lot, half hidden between two collapsed hay balers, stood a truck so ancient and decayed it looked like it had been dug out of the ground rather than rolled in on wheels. It was a 1949 Maro Ranger, an exotic, rare model almost nobody recognized anymore. Its hood sat crooked, one hinge nearly severed by time. Doors were dented inward. The windshield bore a webwork of cracks that caught the sunlight like broken ice. What remained of the original paint clung in small, flaking patches beneath layers of rust thick enough to crumble under a finger. Thomas stopped in front of it and felt something stir that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was a memory, his father's hands, stained with oil and sun, resting proudly on the hood of a similar truck. He remembered the sound it made when the engine turned over, the way his father had smiled when he took Thomas riding down the back roads. His father had always said old trucks were like stubborn mules. They could outlive anything if you treated them right. Standing there staring at the corroded hulk, Thomas didn't see the ruin. He saw the echo of something he'd lost. Around him, the auction crowd noticed where he was looking. A few heads turned. A few snickers drifted through the air. "Poor Hale's really lost it now," someone whispered loud enough for others to hear. "Bet he thinks he can drive that thing home," another chuckled. The auctioneer started the bidding at a laughable price, clearly expecting no takers. But before he could lower it, Thomas lifted his hand. Murmurs rippled through the yard. People twisted to get a better look, whispers multiplying like flies. "You bidding on that pile of rot, Hale?" a man called out. "You planning to use it for target practice?" Even the auctioneer hesitated, giving Thomas a look as if he were asking for confirmation he wasn't drunk. But Thomas didn't lower his hand. He didn't smile. He didn't waver. The bid went uncontested, of course. Nobody else wanted something that looked closer to a fossil than a machine. And when the hammer dropped, Dry Creek officially had itself a new story to pass around. The kind that would grow legs and wander through diners, gas stations, Sunday services, and feed stores for weeks. Thomas didn't acknowledge the stares or the laughter as he walked back to his truck and backed his trailer close. The old Ranger's tires were flat, its axles stiff, and its frame groaned like a dying animal as he winched it aboard. Every creak earned another round of snickers. Someone took a picture. Someone else muttered that the thing would fall apart before he even got it home. But Thomas worked in silence, jaw set, hands steady. When he finished securing the chains, he climbed into his cab and pulled onto the dirt road, watching through the mirror as the rusted carcass jolted behind him. The sun hung lower by the time he reached the gravel drive that led to his farm. The fields rolled out wide and lonely, and the house, modest, clean, but worn from seasons, waited like an old friend too tired to complain. He backed the trailer into the barn with practiced ease, unhooked the chains, and slowly rolled the dead weight of the Ranger inside. The barn doors groaned as he pulled them shut, sealing the truck in the dim, dust-speckled light. For a moment he stood there, hand resting on the old wooden latch, listening to the settling pops of the metal cooling in the quiet. The barn smelled of hay, oil, and old memories. The sun faded outside, painting the sky in deep reds that filtered through the gaps in the boards. People in town would laugh. They already had. By morning, his name would be on every tongue. The story would be embellished, twisted, stretched to ridiculous proportions. Someone would claim he paid a fortune. Someone else would say he had finally gone soft in the head. Someone would insist they knew better than him. But in the silence of his barn, none of that mattered. He turned, walked to the workbench littered with tools, and flicked on the single hanging lamp. Its warm light fell across the ruined truck, catching the rust in a dull orange glow. Thomas exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what he was trying to fix: the truck, the memory of his father, or the part of himself that had felt broken for far too long. But he knew only one thing with certainty. This machine wasn't done. Not yet. Not as long as he had the strength in his hands to fight for it. He rolled up his sleeves. The work would begin tonight. Night settled heavily over Dry Creek, the kind of night that wrapped itself around the barns, fields, and fences like a thick wool blanket. A faint orange glow leaked through the cracks in Thomas's barn doors, pulsing gently with the flicker of the single hanging lamp inside. Outside, the world slept in its familiar stillness. Inside, a man had begun a battle no one else thought worth fighting. The old Maro Ranger sat in the center of the barn like a wounded animal, broken, silent, almost collapsing under the weight of its own decay. The rust on its body looked darker in the lamplight, spreading in mottled islands that devoured the original paint. Dust floated lazily in the warm yellow glow. The air smelled of dry hay, old oil, and the faint metallic bitterness of crumbling steel. Thomas stood in front of the truck, studying it the way a surgeon studies a patient before making the first incision. He ran his hand along the bent edge of the hood, feeling the rough texture of the metal beneath his palm. The truck was worse than he had thought. The frame had buckled in places. The fenders were paper thin. Most of the bolts had fused with rust so tightly they felt like part of the metal itself. The engine compartment looked like a graveyard of broken parts, each one more hopeless than the last. Yet none of this made him doubt. In fact, it seemed to strengthen something inside him. He found a wrench, knelt beside the front wheel, and began loosening the first bolt. It resisted him stubbornly, groaning loudly in the quiet barn. Sweat gathered on his brow as he leaned into the tool with slow, determined pressure. The bolt finally gave way with a crack that echoed through the wooden beams above him. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And so the work began. Hours passed. The world beyond the barn shrank until all that remained was the dim circle of light, the rhythm of metal against metal, and the harsh breaths that came whenever something refused to move. He removed the hood first, lifting it carefully despite its weight. Then the doors, which nearly fell off on their own once he nudged their hinges free. The seats inside disintegrated under his fingers, spilling brittle foam. He dragged away piece after piece, laying them out in rows like bones. He worked until his hands were blackened, until his muscles ached, until the barn floor around him was littered with rust flakes. Somewhere in the middle of it all, memories drifted back uninvited, but welcome. His father's workshop had smelled just like this: oil, steel, and sweat. His father had been a quiet man, stern in some ways but gentle in others, always happiest when he had a wrench in his hand and a stubborn machine in front of him. Thomas remembered sitting nearby as a boy, swinging his legs on an old wooden stool, watching in fascination as his father turned something broken into something beautiful. He remembered the pride in his father's eyes the day he took him riding in the very first truck he had restored. A truck just like the Ranger, now lying in pieces before him. That memory hurt, but it also warmed him. It reminded him why he was doing this. Not to prove something to the town, not even to restore an old machine. He was trying to restore the part of himself that had gone quiet after losing his father. When dawn's first light pressed weakly against the barn doors, Thomas wiped his face with a rag, took a step back, and looked around at what he had done. The Ranger was no longer a single ruined mass. It was several dozen ruined masses scattered in piles, but now he could see the bones beneath the rust. The truck's skeleton, the shape that remained despite the decay. There was hope there. By midday, word had already spread through town. News traveled quickly in Dry Creek, especially when it concerned a spectacle. People drove past Thomas's property slowly, some even turning onto his long, gravel drive to get a better look. They didn't bother to hide their amusement. They sat in their trucks or stood at the fence, laughing at the sight of the broken-down relic in pieces. One man leaned out his window and called across the yard, asking if Thomas planned to fix the truck with duct tape and good intentions. Another neighbor joked loudly about how Thomas was building a metal sculpture for the county fair. Even the teenagers, who usually kept to themselves, circled the farm on their bikes, pointing at the piles of rusty car parts like they had discovered some strange archaeological site. Thomas heard every word. The laughter carried easily through the open barn doors. But he didn't acknowledge any of it. He kept his eyes on the metal in front of him, hands steady, movements deliberate. Inside, however, something tightened. Not anger. Anger was easy. No, this was something deeper. The sting of knowing people had already decided who he was and what he was capable of, without ever taking the time to understand either. He didn't need them to believe in him. He only needed the courage to keep going. Over the next days and weeks, Thomas made regular trips to junkyards and forgotten garages along the countryside. He drove miles out of town following rumors of someone who might still have a part for a ranger. He dug through heaps of old machinery, brushed off decades of dust, sorted through piles of metal in search of something salvageable. Sometimes he returned with nothing but scraped knuckles and disappointment. Other days he came home with treasures: a barely used radiator fan, a set of bolts that perfectly matched the originals, a pair of intact headlights that seemed like tiny miracles. He cleaned each piece meticulously, the barn filled with tubs of solvent, jars of grease, piles of sandpaper. His hands grew cracked, stained with oil even after washing. His arms ached each night when he finally collapsed into bed. Yet every morning he woke before sunrise, drawn back to the barn as if something were calling him forward. Slowly, the Ranger began taking shape. Thomas rebuilt the engine block piece by piece. He sanded away rust until the metal shone beneath. He hammered dents from the fenders, welded cracks, replaced the wiring, and built new brackets for the parts too far gone to save. Sometimes the work felt endless, like pushing against a tide, but every small success pulled him deeper into the task. One evening, long after night had settled again, he stood over the engine bay wiping sweat from his face. The new spark plugs were installed. The starter was in place. The hoses were connected. There was still far more to restore, but the heart of the machine, its engine, was ready for a test. His hands trembled slightly as he slid into the seat, what remained of it, and turned the key. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Only the chirp of crickets outside and the soft hum of the hanging barn lamp filled the quiet. Then the engine choked, coughed, rattled, and with a loud, determined roar, it came to life. Thomas closed his eyes as a wave of emotion washed over him. It wasn't just the sound of a motor turning. It was the sound of history waking up, the sound of his father's voice somewhere in the back of his mind telling him he had done well, the sound of hope. The truck still had miles to go before it would be whole again, but for the first time since dragging it home, Thomas believed fully in what he was doing. He sat there listening to the revived heartbeat of the machine, letting its rhythm fill the barn. Outside, the town still laughed, but inside, Thomas had already won the first battle. The roar of the revived engine echoed in Thomas's mind long after he shut it off that night. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it came in brief flashes of rest, where the dream of his father's old garage blurred with the reality of the barn. By morning, he woke with a clear sense of purpose, as if the sound of that first ignition had settled somewhere deep inside him and hardened into resolve. The Ranger wasn't just a project anymore. It was a promise he intended to keep. Work continued with renewed vigor over the following days. The sun rose and set. The seasons drifted almost imperceptibly, And inside the barn, the truck slowly transformed from a skeleton of rust into something resembling a genuine machine. Thomas replaced the suspension, tightened the new belts, restored the radiator housing, and fabricated replacements for parts that weren't salvageable. Every improvement brought a sense of progress. Like he was piecing together a puzzle with missing fragments, he somehow managed to carve back into existence. But no matter how much he restored, the Ranger still wore its age openly. Patches of rust remained along the lower edges of the doors and quarter panels. The paint, though cleaned of decades of decay, still held the faded ghost of its original color. The dents, though hammered out and smoothed, left behind faint impressions that refused to vanish completely. Instead of fighting these imperfections, Thomas embraced them. They were reminders of where the truck had been, of everything it had survived. They were marks of character. Soon came the day he felt the truck was ready for its first true test. The morning was clear and bright, the kind of morning that carried the earthy scent of dry soil and hinted at a coming heat. Thomas tightened the last bolt beneath the hood, wiped his hands on a rag, and stepped back to look at his work. The Ranger stood solidly on its tires, the frame no longer sagging, the engine ready beneath the patched hood. It looked stubborn, rugged, and maybe even a little proud, like an old fighter standing up one more time. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life instantly, stronger and more confident than before. The vibration traveled through the steering wheel and into his hands. The sound filled the barn and spilled out into the open fields beyond. For the first time since he'd bought it, the truck felt alive, truly alive. Thomas eased it out of the barn and onto the dirt path that led toward the backfields. The Ranger jolted slightly as it hit the uneven ground, but the suspension held firm. The engine didn't sputter or choke. Instead, it responded with a deep, steady growl that made Thomas lift an eyebrow in satisfaction. He urged it forward, accelerating gently down the path. The road behind the farm was a test in itself. Years of rain, tractors, and neglect had carved deep ruts and muddy channels that turned the trail into a jagged obstacle course. Here was where most modern trucks struggled, their traction systems confused by the unpredictable terrain. But the Ranger moved with a kind of heavy confidence, its weight helping it sink just enough to find grip where lighter vehicles would slip. The first large rut came fast. Thomas slowed, angled the truck, and let the front wheel dip into the trench. For a moment the truck tilted sharply, and he braced himself for the groan of metal or the snap of something vital. Instead, the Ranger rolled through the rut with surprising grace, climbing out on the other side with a firm grip on the earth. Dust puffed up behind the tires as they found traction again. Further down the path, the ground grew rougher, rocks jutted from the soil, ridges cut across the trail, and a patch of deep mud waited near a collapsed fence. Thomas aimed straight for it. He wanted to know how much the Ranger could take. The tires churned through the mud, spitting dark clumps behind them. For a few moments, the truck lurched, the engine straining just enough to let him know he'd found a challenge. Then, with a deep surge of torque, it broke through the mire and climbed onto firmer ground. Thomas exhaled, a slow, satisfied breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The test continued for nearly an hour, across rocky slopes, along uneven ridges, through shallow ditches, and between the twisted remains of old fence posts. Not once did the Ranger falter. Not once did it make him doubt the hours he had poured into its restoration. The truck wasn't perfect, it wasn't new, but it was strong, stronger than even he had anticipated. When he finally parked the Ranger back by the barn, he noticed something different in the way the truck sat. It seemed more upright, more settled. As if the test drive had awakened something inside it, some lingering spark of what it used to be. And in a strange way, it seemed to reflect the change happening inside him as well. He left the truck running for a moment longer, listening to the steady hum beneath the hood. It filled him with a quiet pride, a sense of accomplishment that no amount of mocking laughter from the town could diminish. For the first time in a long time, he felt connected to the work, to his father's memory, and to the piece of himself he'd thought had been lost for good. But Dry Creek hadn't changed. People still watched whenever he drove into town, their curiosity sharper now, their amusement turning into something like disbelief. Some residents offered half-hearted compliments. Others suggested he sell the truck before it finally collapsed for good. Most simply couldn't understand why anyone would put so much work into something so old. Thomas didn't mind. He knew what the truck could do. He knew what it meant. And as he drove away from the general store one afternoon, he noticed the wind felt warmer than usual, the air heavier, the sky hazier. It was the kind of weather that hinted at trouble, though no one in town seemed to notice. But Thomas had worked enough seasons, lived through enough dry spells, and seen enough strange shifts in the wind to know when something was off. The ground beneath his boots had felt brittle for weeks. The grass broke beneath the tires instead of bending. And the sunset that evening burned a deeper orange than he'd seen in years, like fire smoldering behind the horizon. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he could feel the vibration of the Ranger's engine through the steering wheel. He didn't know yet what form the danger would take, but he knew the quiet life of Dry Creek was about to change. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of dry heat and distant smoke. Thomas paused beside the barn, looking back toward the distant tree line where the setting sun glowed through the branches. The moment stretched uneasily, like nature itself was holding its breath. The Ranger stood behind him, the last rays of sunlight glinting across its scarred, rust-marked body. The old truck had strength left in it more than anyone in town understood, and soon that strength would be tested in ways Thomas could never have imagined. The evening haze lingered long after sunset, hanging low across the fields like a veil that refused to lift. By morning, the air had turned unnaturally dry, so brittle that every breath felt like it scratched the inside of the throat. The horizon shimmered with a strange heat that didn't belong to the season, and even the birds seemed hesitant to take flight. Thomas woke before dawn, as he always did, but something in the stillness made him pause at the threshold of his porch. The sky carried a faint, unnatural tint, an orange smear just beyond the distant hills, too dull to be sunrise and too steady to be anything but a warning. He stood there for a moment longer, listening. The world felt wrong, not just quiet suppressed. The wind was absent, the air unmoving, the kind of eerie calm that precedes the arrival of a storm. Yet there were no clouds, no thunder, only an oppressive heat that crept over the land like a rising tide. It wasn't until later, when he took the Ranger out to check the fencing along his property, that he smelled it. A thin trace of smoke, faint but unmistakable. Smoke from dry wood, not from a chimney or a backyard fire pit, but from something much larger, something out of control. He turned off the engine and stepped out onto the brittle grass, raising his head toward the distant tree line. The faint orange tint he had noticed in the morning sunlight was growing sharper, darker. He could no longer ignore the uneasiness that had been tugging at him since dawn. By mid-morning, the news reached town. A wildfire had started miles away, past the northern ridge. Some said it came from a lightning strike. Others blamed careless campers. But as the winds began to rise, none of that mattered. Dry Creek had seen fires before, but never one that moved like this one, fast, unpredictable, jumping from tree to tree with frightening ease. The heat of the season and the brittle vegetation had turned the land into a fuse begging to be lit. People gathered outside the small sheriff's office and the volunteer fire station, their faces tight with worry. Smoke had formed a hazy curtain in the sky, turning the sunlight a muted red. Leaves from the few remaining green trees on Main Street trembled in short, restless bursts of wind. The fire chief was on the radio, trying to reach crews from neighboring towns, his voice calm but strained. They were spread thin, too thin. It was clear from the beginning that Dry Creek would have to rely on itself. Thomas arrived in town in the Ranger, the engine rumbling steadily beneath him. As he parked near the fire station, several residents turned to look. Under normal circumstances, their expressions might have held amusement or skepticism, as they so often did when Thomas drove the rusty truck through town. But today there was no laughter, only tension. Still, their eyes lingered on the Ranger in uncertainty, perhaps wondering what good an old truck could be in a crisis. While the fire chief coordinated efforts, rumors began to ripple through the crowd. The fire was expanding faster than predicted. Entire patches of forest were already gone. Some of the back roads had become impassable due to fallen trees and shifting soil. Then someone mentioned the families who lived in the lower basin, a small, isolated community tucked between steep slopes and thick woods. They had little time and almost no way of knowing just how quickly the fire was closing in on them. Thomas felt his stomach twist. He knew that area well. The roads leading to it were narrow, broken, and prone to erosion. In dry summer months, they turned into loose gravel and cracked earth. In wet seasons, they became mud traps. Even at the best of times, only a handful of vehicles could navigate them safely. And now, with the fire sweeping across the ridge, fallen trees and sudden collapses would make the terrain even more treacherous. He stepped closer to the fire chief, who was pacing by the radio. The chief's voice was a low hum of frustration. His volunteer trucks were too heavy to maneuver past the fallen trunks. His smaller vehicles were too fragile to risk the incoming debris in unpredictable ground. And even if a crew managed to make it through, they might not return before the flames swept over the basin. They needed a vehicle with the strength of a workhorse and the resilience of something built long before modern convenience softened the design of machines. Thomas looked over his shoulder at the Ranger parked nearby, the rust on its body gleaming faintly in the dim red light filtering through the haze. The truck looked old, weathered, out of place among the polished emergency vehicles. But he knew its capabilities now. He had tested them. He had felt the way it bit into the earth, clawed through mud, and surged over rock. If any vehicle could reach the families trapped in the basin, it was the Ranger. People hurried through town with boxes, hoses, blankets, and supplies, preparing for evacuation. Fear flashed through their movements. The smoke crept lower, thicker, stinging the eyes and burning the throat. The wind picked up with a restless, unnerving howl. Cars sped down the road towards safer regions, while others clustered at the center of town waiting for instructions. Suddenly, a radio crackled from inside the station. A deputy's voice came through, urgent and strained. He had managed to get close to the basin, but not close enough. A fallen tree had blocked the road. Beyond that, another collapse had torn the ground open, leaving only a narrow path wide enough for something small and sturdy. The families were still there, dozens of them, children, elderly, pets. They were surrounded by smoke, their way out disappearing by the minute. The crowd stiffened. The fire chief cursed under his breath. Everyone knew what this meant. They had minutes to act, maybe less. But no one moved. No one volunteered. No one had a vehicle that could survive the journey, let alone return with people in tow. No one except Thomas. He didn't make a speech, nor did he wait for someone to ask. The decision happened inside him quietly, as naturally as breathing. He walked toward the Ranger and rested his hand on the warm, rusted metal of the door. The truck seemed to hum gently, as if acknowledging the moment, as if it understood. People turned to watch him. The fire chief jogged toward him, calling his name. But Thomas shook his head. He knew the risks. He knew the road. He knew the fire. But he also knew something else, something deeper, something that had been forged into him over months in the barn and years of living through hardship on the land. It was more than stubbornness. It was responsibility. He opened the door, climbed into the seat, and turned the key. The engine roared immediately, a deep, steady growl that cut through the shouts and radio chatter around him. It drowned out the sound of fear and replaced it with something fierce and determined. The fire chief approached the driver's side window, urgency in his eyes, but also something like respect. He tried to give instructions, warnings, details about the route. Thomas nodded once. He would navigate based on instinct. He had driven those roads for decades. He knew every bend, every dip, every patch of treacherous ground, and now he had a machine built for surviving what lay ahead. As he shifted into gear, a gust of wind carried a wave of thick smoke across town, darkening the sky. Sirens wailed somewhere behind him. People shouted to one another. The fire advanced with terrifying speed, devouring everything in its path. Thomas pressed the accelerator. The Ranger lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of dust as it shot down the road toward the burning ridge. The ground trembled beneath the tires. Flames flickered in the distance where the valley opened into the basin. Smoke billowed in towering spirals, swirling like dark storm clouds dragged down to the earth. And just like that, the quiet life of Dry Creek ended. The fire had come suddenly violent, hungry, unstoppable. The families in the basin had little time left, but so long as the Ranger kept moving, they still had hope. Thomas tightened his grip on the wheel and drove straight into the rising smoke. The moment Thomas steered the Ranger toward the ridge, the world behind him seemed to dissolve into chaos. The steady rumble of the engine drowned beneath the distant roar of the wildfire, a sound like a living beast tearing through the forest with unstoppable hunger. Smoke drifted toward him in rolling waves, thickening the air until it tasted of ash and bitterness. Yet he didn't slow. The old truck pushed forward, its tires grinding over the dry earth, its metal frame rattling in protest as if aware of the tremendous weight now placed upon it. The farther he drove from town, the more the familiar road changed. The sky dimmed under a blanket of rising smoke, turning midday into a strange half-darkness where orange light flickered like lightning trapped behind clouds. Thomas narrowed his eyes against the sting. The Ranger kept climbing the incline toward the ridge, chewing through loose gravel and cracked earth with the stubborn tenacity of a machine built in an era when durability mattered more than refinement. As he reached the crest, the full horror of the fire revealed itself. Flames raged across the treetops in a sweeping wall of heat, devouring branches with terrifying speed. The forest hissed and cracked, sending sparks into the air like fireflies from a nightmare. Below in the basin, the small cluster of houses stood painfully still, surrounded on all sides by smoke and approaching fire. Panic rose in Thomas's chest as he traced his path forward. The primary road leading down into the basin was blocked by a massive fallen pine, its bark still smoking from a recent spark. The ground around it had split into jagged trenches where heat had fractured the earth. No modern truck would make it through, but the Ranger wasn't modern. Thomas shifted into low gear and angled the truck toward a narrower path to the right. A half-forgotten trail eroded by years of rain and neglect. The descent was steep and the soil loose under the tires. The Ranger slid dangerously, its rear end fishtailing as gravity pulled it downward with aggressive force. Thomas gripped the wheel until his knuckles whitened, easing the brakes to keep control without losing momentum. Rocks clattered beneath the undercarriage. Branches slapped the windows. The heat intensified, pressing through the metal doors as if trying to seep inside and smother him. Halfway down the slope, the first obstacle appeared, a tangle of burning branches blocking most of the path. Flames licked the edges of the trail, and the air shimmered with brutal intensity. Thomas knew that stopping meant losing his chance entirely. He pressed the accelerator. The Ranger roared in response, surging forward. Flaming branches scraped across the sides, leaving black streaks and bursts of sparks in their wake. Heat crashed over the windshield like a wave, fogging the glass for a split second before the airflow cleared it again. The truck burst through. Thomas coughed, his lungs burning. Sweat trickled down his back, despite the cool air, from the cracked window. But the path ahead widened, leading deeper into the basin. He could see movement now, figures stumbling outside their homes, clutching belongings, shielding their faces from the smoke. A few waved their arms desperately when they spotted the Ranger approaching. He reached the houses just as the eastern slope ignited. Fire erupted along the ridge behind them, spreading downward like molten fingers reaching for the roofs. The families huddled together, children crying, pets whimpering, elderly neighbors coughing into cloths pressed to their mouths. When Thomas rolled to a stop, disbelief washed over their faces. Some knew him by name. Others only knew him as the quiet farmer who kept to himself. But one thing became clear in the reflection of their frightened eyes. They saw the Ranger as their last chance. Thomas climbed out, covering his mouth with a rag. "Load up," he shouted, his voice cracking against the roar of the fire. "As many as you can fit in the back. We don't have long." People moved quickly. Mothers lifted children into the bed of the truck. Fathers hoisted elderly parents, cradling them as gently as possible amidst the urgency. Dogs leapt in beside them, tails tucked in fear. Thomas counted them, ensuring no one was left behind. There were too many to take in one trip, but leaving anyone here without a guarantee of return felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He had to try. When the truck was full, he slammed the tailgate shut and climbed back in. The flames had reached the southern slope now, spreading across dry brush like water spilled across a table. He didn't have time to think about the return route. He didn't have time to plan anything at all. He only had instinct and the Ranger. He reversed quickly, swinging the truck around with a wide arc that sent dust spiraling. The engine strained under the weight, but it didn't falter. The path back up the basin was narrower now, the flames having consumed fallen debris and reshaped the ground with scorching chaos. Thomas pushed the Ranger harder, feeling every vibration through the steering wheel. Smoke swallowed them in thick clouds, turning the world into a suffocating gray void. The heat on his left side felt unbearable, the fire creeping closer with each second. Then as he approached the steepest incline, the frightening truth revealed itself. The slope had partially collapsed. Where solid earth once was, now lay a jagged cut of soil and rock, barely wide enough for a single tire. If the truck slipped, even by an inch, they would tumble sideways into the burning underbrush below. Thomas braced his arms, positioned the wheels precisely, and prayed that the Ranger was worthy of the faith he'd placed in it. The front tire climbed onto the narrow ridge. The truck tilted sharply, the world leaning dangerously sideways. A child screamed from the back. Someone cried out a prayer. Thomas held the wheel straight, refusing to breathe as the rear tires followed. The truck lurched. For a terrifying second, it felt as if the Ranger would tip. The weight of the passengers shifted. The metal groaned. But somehow, perhaps through some forgotten engineering brilliance or sheer stubborn luck, the truck corrected itself and climbed past the collapse, pulling them back onto stable ground. Thomas exhaled shakily. His heart pounded so loudly he almost didn't hear the crack of burning timber behind him. A massive flaming branch crashed onto the trail, barely missing the Ranger's tail end. When they reached the ridge, smoke swallowed the horizon. Thomas hurried to the designated safe zone where firefighters directed evacuees. He stopped the truck, jumped out, and helped people down one by one. Their relief was palpable, full of trembling gratitude and tear-streaked faces. But he didn't stay. Even before the last child touched the ground, he was already turning back toward the basin. There were more people waiting. The second trip was harder. The fire had grown more violent, leaping across the basin from slope to slope. Falling ash formed a strange, haunting snowstorm that blanketed everything in gray. The ground cracked beneath the Ranger's tires, and Thomas felt the temperature rise with every yard he advanced. He found 3 people hiding near a storage shed, 2 brothers and their elderly aunt. They had been too afraid to leave their home earlier, but now fear pushed them into Thomas's arms. He loaded them into the cab and turned the truck around, navigating through a forest that no longer resembled anything living. Flames consumed the trees, leaving behind skeletal blackened trunks. Sparks rained down like burning insects. The path he'd taken earlier was gone now, replaced by molten embers and collapsed debris. He had to carve a new route, one he could only barely recognize. At one point, the fire surrounded them entirely. A ring of flames circled the Ranger, the heat so intense it felt like a furnace on all sides. The engine sputtered once, twice, and Thomas felt dread claw at his throat. But the old machine refused to die. He pressed the accelerator. The engine roared defiantly, surging forward through an opening barely wider than the truck itself. Flames rolled over the hood in a wave of orange fury, but broke as the Ranger burst through, carrying them into fresh air. When they reached safety, firefighters rushed toward the passengers, helping them out with urgency and disbelief. The aunt clung to Thomas, sobbing into his shoulder. The brothers looked at him with awe, as though he had walked through fire itself. But Thomas didn't stay to hear their gratitude. He looked back at the burning ridge. There were still people he hadn't found. He had counted more houses, more families, more souls who could be waiting. He turned back to the truck. The Ranger groaned, covered in soot and flickering embers, its metal warm beneath his hand. It had survived more than any machine should, but it still ran. It still responded, and as long as it did, he could not stop. "Just one more," he whispered, though he didn't know if he spoke to the truck or himself. He didn't make only one more trip. He made 3, then 4. Each journey into the basin grew more dangerous than the last. The fire moved unpredictably. The ground shifted. The smoke thickened to near blindness. Each time the Ranger clawed its way through mud, over fallen trees, around burning wreckage, up unstable slopes. With each return, more passengers, some staggering, some carried escaped death by minutes. By the final trip, Thomas's hands shook on the wheel. His throat burned. His skin felt raw. The Ranger's engine rattled like an exhausted beast. The hood scorched black. The side panels warped from heat. But it kept going, kept moving, kept fighting. With one last surge of strength, it climbed the final slope, carrying the last frightened family out of the basin just as flames swallowed the path behind them, turning everything below into a lake of fire. When they reached the safe zone for the final time, the Ranger came to a trembling stop. Its engine coughed, sputtered, and fell silent. Not in defeat, but like a warrior allowed to rest at last. Thomas stepped out on unsteady legs. People rushed around him, voices blurring into indistinct noise. But he could feel their gratitude, their relief, their awe. And in that moment, as the world burned behind him, he realized something profound. The town had mocked the Ranger. They had mocked him. But neither had broken. Side by side, man and machine had done what no one else could. Together, they had outraced a fire. The fire still raged across the ridge long after the last family had been brought to safety, its glow staining the sky a deep and unsettling red. The safe zone, set up hastily in an open clearing, buzzed with frantic motion as firefighters, medics, and volunteers tended to the rescued. Shouts of relief mingled with sobs of exhaustion. Children clung to their parents, trembling. Elderly neighbors huddled under blankets, their faces ashen from smoke. But amid the chaos, every pair of eyes seemed drawn to a single sight, the battered, soot-blackened shape of the old Maro Ranger. The truck sat in the dirt, its body warped with heat, its paint blistered into strange new patterns of rust and charcoal. Embers clung stubbornly to the hood, still glowing faintly at the edges. The once sturdy frame sagged as if bearing the weight of everything it had endured. Steam drifted from beneath the hood in thin white ribbons. The headlights were clouded with ash, their glass cracked but intact. It looked as though it had been sculpted out of fire itself and dragged through the heart of the inferno to emerge on the other side. Thomas leaned against the door, catching his breath. His clothes were soaked with sweat and streaked with soot. His throat burned, his hands shook, and a deep, pounding ache pulsed behind his eyes. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion, but when he looked toward the families gathering near the medical tents, children safe in their mothers' arms, elderly neighbors wrapped in blankets, men helping one another stand, he felt a warmth that cut through the lingering chill of fear. He had done it. They had done it. He and the Ranger. When the fire chief approached, his usually stern face softened with something like reverence. There were streaks of ash across his uniform, and his voice cracked from hours of shouting orders, but his eyes shone with unmistakable gratitude. "You saved them," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. "Every last one." He shook his head slowly, as though the weight of what had happened was only now settling. "I don't know how you made it through that basin. No one else could get anywhere near it." Thomas just nodded, unable to speak. His body felt too drained for words, but he reached out and placed a hand on the Ranger's warm, soot-covered fender. The metal was scorched and rough beneath his fingertips. The truck hummed faintly, as if the heat inside it hadn't fully dissipated. It didn't feel like a vehicle anymore. It felt like a companion faithful, unyielding, forged through fire into something greater. As the crowd grew around the safe zone, whispers spread. People approached cautiously at first, their expressions full of awe. One man stepped forward, his voice trembling as he tried to thank Thomas for rescuing his wife. A young mother with streaks of soot across her cheeks clutched her little girl and whispered, "We thought we were gone. You brought us back." An elderly woman, shaking from the cold of fear rather than the night air, touched Thomas's arm with a trembling hand and murmured blessings under her breath. Others offered their gratitude without words. A nod, a clasp of the hand, a look that held a depth of emotion Thomas felt in his chest. Over and over they glanced at the Ranger, their gazes softening, their fear slowly replaced by relief. No one laughed at the truck anymore. No one smirked at the rust or the battered body. They looked at it as if it were a monument, a symbol of survival. As firefighters moved between the evacuees, guiding them toward warmth and water, one of them paused near Thomas. He stared at the Ranger and let out a low whistle. "Hell of a machine," he murmured, "and hell of a man driving it." Thomas shook his head, wiping soot from his brow. "The machine did the hard part," he replied, though his voice was still raspy. The firefighter smiled faintly. Machines don't go where you push that one. He gestured with a tilt of his helmet toward the ridge. It wasn't just steel that pulled those people out. It was you. But Thomas couldn't bring himself to accept that entirely. All he could think of were the moments when the Ranger had felt like it would give out, when the fire had wrapped around them, and yet the truck had surged forward anyway. He knew the truth. He had rebuilt the Ranger with his hands, but tonight it had shown him a strength he hadn't expected. It had given everything it had left, refusing to quit until the last life was safe. When the immediate danger had finally passed, and the worst of the fire redirected by coordinated efforts, the crowd began to thin. Some evacuees were taken to shelters. Others, too shaken to leave immediately, remained in the clearing, sharing quiet conversations or huddling in silence. The night grew colder, and stars blinked through the smoke as the sky cleared little by little. Thomas lingered beside the Ranger long after most people had been guided to safety. The adrenaline that had pushed him through the ordeal drained away, leaving behind a deep, reflective stillness. He ran a hand across the hood, feeling the jagged, blistered texture of the metal. Every mark was a testament: the melted paint, the warped panels, the soot-blackened seams. Once the town had called this truck worthless, a joke, a piece of junk unfit to sit in a scrapyard. But now, as people walked by it with reverence in their eyes, Thomas felt something shift inside him. A profound recognition that this old machine had proven its worth beyond measure. Children wandered close to look before being gently pulled back by parents, fearful they'd cut themselves on the sharp edges. They stared at the truck with wide eyes as if it were a creature from a legend. One boy tugged at his father's sleeve and asked whether the truck was magic. His father chuckled and shook his head. "No," he said softly, staring at the Ranger with a look of newfound respect. "Just built to last." Eventually the fire chief returned with news that the basin was now officially cleared and secure. No one had been left behind. Every home was gone, but every life had been saved. He looked at Thomas for a long moment, weighing words carefully, then extended his hand. "You didn't just save people," he said. "You saved this whole town. We'll remember this." Thomas shook his hand, still feeling the ache in his arms and the sting of smoke in his lungs. Saving the town wasn't what he'd set out to do. He had only known he couldn't sit by when others needed help. Perhaps his father would have done the same. In some ways, the journey through the fire felt like something he had been preparing for without knowing it. The Ranger, silent beside him, seemed to settle deeper into the earth, its presence grounding him. It looked beaten and broken in places, its body scarred beyond repair, but it stood tall in the cooling night air. When dawn began to creep over the horizon, the sky shifting from smoke-stained gray to pale blue, the Ranger caught the first rays of sunlight. Despite the soot and the scorched metal, it reflected the light faintly, as though something beneath the burnt exterior still shone. Thomas stood there quietly, hands in his pockets, watching the truck glow under the morning sun. There was no laughter now, no mocking smiles, only gratitude, only respect. Only the quiet, humbling truth that courage sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. In that moment, he understood fully what had driven him to restore the truck. Not vanity, not nostalgia, but a belief that things broken were not things lost. That rust didn't mean ruin. That strength could lie hidden beneath years of neglect. The Ranger was proof of that, and perhaps so was he. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the night finally lifting. As the sun rose higher and the smoke cleared from the ridge, Thomas reached out and rested his hand on the Ranger's battered hood. The fire hadn't beaten them. Not him, not the truck. Together they had made it through the flames, and neither would ever be underestimated again.